Also today we want to take a look at interest groups and the role they play in society. So we're going to look at just some ideas about interest groups and some theories about how interest groups function. But first, this is an example of an interest group. We probably haven't seen much of them lately, but a few years ago, a local interest group would be the kind of thing that would form around the idea of saving the Greens Ward. So a group of people concerned about the policies in Overton Park and the zoo parking. But that's exactly what an interest group is. Just a bunch of people get together. Doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat or whatever. They just care about the particular policy. And in this case, they wanted to change the parking policy of the Memphis Zoo. So a really good, easy example of an interest group and how an interest group gives people a lot of opportunity to influence what happens at a local level and based on policy instead of party loyalty. So we'll start in the Constitution. We want to find out where would we find the rights for interest groups to exist? And if we go to the Constitution, we find that right in the First Amendment. So we know that there's freedom of speech. That allows you to express your attitude about the government. That allows you to express your ideas for what policies are good and what policies are bad. So if a person has freedom of speech, is there any reason why a group of people wouldn't have freedom of speech together? And logically, of course not. So if a person has freedom of speech, then a group of people collectively also have free speech rights. Freedom of assembly is that, the right to peacefully assemble together. That allows us to organize in groups. So these two parts of the First Amendment together, the freedom of assembly and the freedom of speech, allow groups of people to advocate for political ideas and policy preferences. Because we can get together in groups and advocate for our wishes, that is the basis of an interest group. That's exactly what an interest group does. So because of the First Amendment, interest groups are allowed to exist and allowed to express their policy preferences. Let's go all the way back to Federalist 10. So this will definitely be a review of something we haven't talked about in a long time. But remember the arguments of Federalist 10, they were warning us about factions. That's what an interest group is. Interest group is a great example of a faction, and we can see why interest groups are a little bit dangerous. Interest groups want what's best for the members of their group. They don't really focus on what is necessarily best for the country as a whole. So interest groups look out for what's best for the people that are a part of their group. For example, the National Rifle Association wants to pass policies that would allow people to carry guns into places like bars. That's great for the people that are gun owners in the National Rifle Association, but that might not be the best policy for the country as a whole. So that's what a faction is, right? A faction looks out for its group interest ahead of what's best for the country as a whole. Now, because we just said there's freedoms in the First Amendment that allow interest groups to exist, we can't prevent them. But the best thing we can do is control their effects. So one of the best ways that we control the effects that interest groups have on policies is by having lots of other interest groups. There are going to be groups with competing interests that will keep the interest groups in check. That's exactly the basis of this theory that we call pluralism. Pluralism is just a theory that explains how society works, especially relating to policy here. So society is just made up of a collection of different groups of people. Each group is going to do what's best for their own group. And that's not weird. That's just how things work. So what they're saying here is that the groups are naturally going to end up competing with each other to try and get their interests pushed. When the groups compete with each other, they actually limit each other. They limit any one group from becoming super powerful. They prevent any groups from being able to get all of their goals achieved. Because if there's a group that wants some policy passed, there's probably going to be another group that wants the opposite thing here. And so when those groups compete together, it limits the power of any one group. There may be some big, strong groups out there. There may be some really powerful interest groups. But even smaller opposition groups can work together. They can form coalitions to have, about an even-sized opposition here. So while the NRA is a big, powerful interest group that promotes gun rights, there are several small interest groups that promote gun control that often work together to limit the power of the NRA. So pluralism just tells us that there's going to be a bunch of groups and that they're going to compete with each other, and that competition is good because it prevents any of the groups from becoming super powerful. So these are just some types of groups that we see that help us make sense of the idea of pluralism. Like businesses are going to have like powerful and rich interest groups. They're not going to have tons and tons of public support, but they're going to make arguments for things like deregulation. But we'll have like a bunch of public support for things like environmental groups. Those will be made up of a lot of people that care about the environment. They'll have a lot of public support. Consumer protection groups are really effective in lobbying. Like people aren't super passionate about consumer protection, but they do a great job talking to lawmakers. And so while the business groups are huge, powerful, have a lot of money that they can use to impact policy, the environmental groups and the consumer protection groups can work together to limit the power of these business interests. So that's what we're seeing with pluralism. We're seeing groups limiting each other's power. It's good for us to let a variety of groups exist because they will keep each other from being able to dominate politics. Hyperpluralism is a more critical way of looking at the same ideas here. So hyperpluralism it starts with the same understanding as pluralism, that there's a bunch of groups and that these groups are all pursuing their own interests and all this kind of stuff. But hyperpluralism would argue that the groups have become way too powerful, that the groups end up now with all of the power in government. Hyperpluralism would tell us that the government can't get anything done because of the power of these groups. Anytime we're trying to pass policy, lawmaking really slows down and we end up with a lot of gridlock because these powerful groups prevent any laws from being passed. Hyperpluralism would say that the government is ineffective because of the power of these groups. So we can see examples of this. Unfortunately, this is pretty high profile when there are school shootings. If you guys know the Sandy Hook school shooting, this is where a shooter went and took the lives of a lot of children in kindergarten. This was a really big moment for America because support for gun control policies really reached its high point. So at the time, right after this, polling would tell us that 90% of Americans want bans on semi-automatic weapons. This is in 2012. So following this school shooting that was particularly violent and very sad, like 90% of Americans wanted particular limits on guns passed. Congress refused to pass any laws following this that would limit gun rights in any way. This is because many congressmen get big donations from the NRA for every election. Congressmen rely on the money from NRA to keep their campaigns going, and they rely on the endorsements and the advertising from the NRA that helps mobilize the voters behind them. So they depend on the NRA to keep winning elections way more than they care about the 90% of public support for a particular policy. So this is just one of many examples that we can see of how the government can't really do what the people want because the interest group ends up with more power over the lawmakers. The lawmakers are more concerned with making the interest group upset than they are with making a huge majority of the public upset. We can also see hyperpluralism in action with healthcare reform. The American healthcare system we talked about is a huge mess. It's so expensive. We don't have better health outcomes than other countries and stuff like this. There's a lot of public support for major changes to the American healthcare system. And in 2008, President Obama promised that as part of his campaign. So he was going to he proposed a major overhaul of the American healthcare system. But we've got to deal with lots of different interest groups. So insurance companies have powerful interest groups, and they want to make sure that none of these changes hurt their profits. Pharmaceutical companies, they represent, companies that make medicine. They have huge interest groups that are very powerful, have lots of money. The AMA, the American Medical Association, this is an interest group for doctors that we'll talk about. They want to make sure that their people don't end up making any less money. So between insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, doctor interest groups, all these groups work together to make sure that the bill that was passed didn't hurt them in any way. And so while the government made policies, they kept these interest groups in mind, and the voters end up left with a reform bill that people weren't really happy with. It didn't change much. It forced American people to purchase health insurance from a private insurance company. It did make some major changes that people are happy about, but these interest groups definitely prevented major structural changes that would have helped a lot of people. So we see that hyperpluralism, while not necessarily true, we can see some reasons why people would suggest that interest groups are too powerful and dominate the policymaking. All right, time for us to take a look at all of the things we've talked about today. Time to go through our bigly ideas. And here's President Trump. He looks like he's about to get to work. He's got on his hard hat and he is ready to go, giving us the thumbs up to finish our last week of notes. So as we get a understanding, like our first little bit of stuff about interest groups, we want to make sure first that we can tell the difference between interest groups and political parties. All those different things, all those different ways that we can tell the difference between what's an interest group and what's a political party. And the most obvious of those is, do they run somebody for office? If they run somebody for office, we're going to call that a political party. We want to describe all the roles of interest groups in influencing policy. So what are all the things that interest groups do, from advertising to the public, to trying to persuade lawmakers, trying to mobilize support? We want to make sure we remember the ideas the framers have about interest groups, so particularly Federalist 10. Federalist 10 is a really important argument for why we can't stop interest groups from forming, but we need to be able to control them. And one of the best ways to control them is let them compete with each other. So that leads us right into the next thing. We want to make sure we can explain these theories of pluralism, which tells us that all the groups are competing with each other, and that's good. They'll limit each other. But hyperpluralism tells us that these groups are too powerful and they prevent good policy from getting made. Now that we've got some idea of what interest groups are, it's time for us to start looking at a whole lot of examples. So we're going to start to talk about all the different types of interest groups and come up with a bunch of different examples of interest groups that I'm pretty sure you guys would have heard of before. So we'll take a look at the different types of interest groups and their abilities to influence policy.